Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to another webinar in our Finding a Unicorn Small Wastewater System Funding Series. Today's session is on compelling federal award applications, and it's part 1 of 2 sessions. My name is Zoe Eisel from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics, and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. One of the many ways EFCN can support your community or utility is through our free funding application support. Struggling with an infrastructure funding application, falling short on project funding, not sure where to start? EFCN is here to help. Use the link in the chat to submit a request and receive tailored support based on your project's needs. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenters for today, Sarah Diefendorf, Director, and Tamira Jones, Federal Grants Officer, both from Capacity Collaborative. Welcome, Sarah and Tamira, and I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Zoe, can you give me share access? Thank you.
Okay, it looks like you're good, Tamira.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, welcome everybody to session 2 in Finding a Unicorn, Small Wastewater System Funding Series. And today we're going to be talking about compelling applications. I am Sarah Diefendorf, and the person with the beautiful flowers is Tamira Jones, who will be doing most of the talking today. My turn to talk more is in session 3. So let me just give you an overview of what's going on. Next. So we're doing this series. It's designed to address the needs of small wastewater systems, less than 10,000. And at the Capacity Collaborative, we've been working with small wastewater systems for many years now, basically from Puerto Rico to Hawaii and many, many states in between. Our expertise tends to towards federal funding, obviously, as well as board development. We do work a lot with small water and wastewater system boards. We provide communications services, and sort of our newest efforts focus around helping to develop utilities. That includes things like bylaws and operating procedures and so on. Our 12-part series, of which this is part 2, is basically today is about compelling applications part 1, which is really going to be getting into the nuts and bolts of what do you do in grants.gov, what does it look like, and so on. On Thursday, we're going to be digging more into compelling applications. Then sessions 4 and 5, moving into the new year, will be focused on SRF with some office hours. We'll talk about federal award management, which is always trickier than you think it is. procurement standards, and negotiating indirect rates, also a tricky thing. And then finally, we'll be talking about closeouts and provide a final office hours. Next.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I'll share a little bit about today's purpose. In this session, part 1 of compelling applications, I'm going to share a lot about understanding federal award prerequisites and how to prepare your organization to apply and manage a public grant, and also help guide review of a federal award notice and application requirements. So really getting into the nitty-gritty of what to expect when applying, and share some tools for preparing a federal grant budget, which always seems to be the part folks leave till the last, and it requires a lot of nuance. And so, as Sarah mentioned in Thursday's session, which hopefully you can also register for, we'll focus more on understanding local needs supported by qualitative and quantitative data, which will really inform your project narrative, and then building a logic model that clearly establishes inputs, outputs, and outcomes, which all support a compelling application. So today's agenda, I'm going to recap a little bit from the session 1 we did a couple weeks ago, which was about where's all the funding at. So just quickly run through some of the funding opportunities we covered in more detail in the last session, and then talk a little bit about the phases of award management. Obviously, today we're going to focus on preparation in the application phase, and as part of that, looking at grants.gov and how to search for grant opportunities for wastewater infrastructure, and how to review a notice of funding opportunity. And also talk through a little bit of the components of a project plan and developing that. We have a tool that's also in that materials list tab and GoToMeetings, in addition to the slides, which is an Excel template for an application work plan that you can copy and use. And we'll talk a little bit about the process of planning out your application process. And then, as I mentioned, talking about budget. We would love to have time for Q&A. I'm not 100% sure. This is a lot of content to cover in one session. If we don't have time, do know we'll have time on Thursday, and we also have that office hours in February where you can bring more about your challenges and opportunities, and we can get into it in that time slot. So do register for that. Disclaimer, this session is a lot of text on slides, which we typically wouldn't do, but we really wanted this slide deck to be a resource for everyone on the call. So do download it. These are all linked. I did want to share some of the programs that we mentioned and some new ones that we didn't get time to from the last session around the funding landscape. Many of these you may know are related to USDA and EPA resources. As you might know, USDA Rural Development has the Water and Waste Disposal Loan and Grant Program, which provides low interest and grants for building and improving drinking water, sanitary sewage, and storm drainage systems in rural areas with populations of 10,000 or less. Of course, we spent a lot of time talking about Clean Water SRF, which also offers low interest loans for water quality projects for both centralized and decentralized wastewater treatment systems. And then I included EPA's rural small and tribal technical assistance program because I saw there were a lot of folks who registered for this call who are consultants supporting wastewater system providers. And this grant program provides funding to organizations that deliver technical assistance and training to small systems to help improve their operations, manage finances, and apply for funding. And then EPA's non-point source grant program, we didn't talk too much about it last time, but do know that there are grants to help prevent water pollution from non-point source, which can also include decentralized wastewater systems. So check that out. And then we talked a little bit about the community development block grant through HUD, which just can be used for water and wastewater projects in eligible communities. And then we didn't talk about Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. WIFIA does provide credit assistance for water infrastructure programs, and this program is also administered by EPA and can support large-scale projects. I know we've been focused on small systems, but lots of places to look for funding and get support. Obviously, visit some of the program websites we mentioned. EPA, USDA rural development websites provide information on programs, usually open programs for application. WEP, which is the Rural Utility Service and Water Program. It's for rural communities to obtain technical assistance and financing to develop drinking water and waste disposal systems. So new systems or expansion of systems, primarily in rural communities with a population of 10,000 or less. And there's a lot of TA assistance out there, obviously EFCN, but also EVA's is funding the National Rural Water Association and Rural Community Assistance Partnership, which both offer help with applications and project development. The state rural water associations have staff all over the country in all 50 states and tribes, tribally owned systems and territories. So they, along with RCAP, have great training series for utility managers if you haven't checked that out. And then I think we said it probably a dozen times last week to contact state agencies. So that link does connect to all the clean water SRF administrators in every state. State water boards and environmental agencies have their own programs and obviously can provide the most specific guidance on state opportunities. So that link does go to the staff administrator for each state program. And then there's lots of databases for looking at wastewater funding, including the Water Finance Clearinghouse, catalog of federal funding sources for watershed protection. The Finance Clearinghouse does have 2 searchable databases. One contains available funding sources for water infrastructure, and the second contains resources such as like reports, web links, things that can be really helpful for putting your application together. Grants.gov is the federal clearinghouse for all active federal grant programs. We're going to get into more detail on searching for that. And then most states have their own state grant portal. I'm in California, so the California Grants Portal, it's an example where we have state level funding resources listed there, including state water resources control programs, and that's searchable. There's a whole category on water and environmental grants. So I did want to get into the word salad that often happens when talking about federal grant opportunities. We use a lot of acronyms and terminology. I've already mentioned a bunch. Some of the websites, grants.gov, which is the federal clearinghouse for all funding opportunities, sam.gov, which I'm going to be talking more about. We talked a lot in the first session about getting your system for award management registry in order to apply for federal funds. That might be its own session one day on problem solving, sam.gov, but it is required that your utility or organization be registered in order to apply. ASAP.gov, that's the automated system for application for payments. A lot of federal agencies, about 65, use ASAP for managing drawdown of funds. And then I wanted to mention a couple award roles. Sometimes these get thrown around, or you might see it in notice the funding opportunity, but there's 3 roles within an application and grant award process. The prime recipient obviously is the person who receives a federal award directly from a federal agency and is ultimately responsible for its management. Some of you might find yourself in a subrecipient role where you receive a subaward from the prime entity to carry out an activity under award, and sometimes the state can be the prime recipient and city, county, or municipality might be a subrecipient. I'm currently in that position with a community development block grant. And then contractors, just to be really clear, the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor is a contractor is providing goods or service either to the prime or subrecipient, but does not have decision-making over the role. This will become more relevant when you're putting your budget together and trying to determine where to put expenses. Is somebody really a subrecipient or a contractor? And then I won't go through all these acronyms. I already mentioned the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO. That is or funding opportunity announcement. That's when there's a grant program out there and it gets released. Federal requirements require agencies to list funding opportunities for 60 days. Oftentimes they can be up for longer, but just know if you see something and it looks like it's a good fit to act on it, might not be up there forever. An RFP, request for proposals, commonly used when either soliciting grant applications or if you need to put something out for bid, you'd put out an RFP. A NICRA is a negotiated indirect rate agreement. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to do a whole session on once you've gotten federal funding or if you had federal funding in the past, you can apply for a higher indirect rate than the de minimis, which is 15%. For your actual costs, overhead related to doing these programs. UEI, that's really important. It's a unique entity identifier, and that's assigned when you register for sam.gov, and you are needed to do, you need that in order to apply for federal grants. CFR, those are the rules that guide how federal funds can be used. I'll talk again later. OMB is the Office of Budget Management. They come up with the uniform administrative guidelines for all federal grants. FAR, some of you may find yourself contracting with the federal government, and those rules and guidance fall under federal acquisition regulation as opposed to administrative guidelines. So you may see reference. BABA, which stands for Build American, Buy American, comes out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, requiring American-made materials be used in federal infrastructure projects. And DBRA stands for Davis-Bacon and Related Acts, which has to do with required prevailing wage on public infrastructure projects. And I'm going to do a session on procurement. We'll get into BABA and DBRA in a much more detailed way. I like to kind of give folks the full rainbow of the application and really the award management process of federal grants. So we're going to be focused on pre-application and application today. There's a lot of steps under both those things. Pre-application is you're developing your project, you're assigning folks to be leading on application research, leading on developing the project proposal or budget, leading on implementing the project, and leading on financially managing and reporting on the project. Pre-application, you're looking at notices of funding, you're attending webinars about funding opportunities, you're developing your budget and project plan before you've even started an application. And then the application process, we're going to talk a little bit about creating an application work plan just to make the process much more transparent and delegated, and so we'll get into that. Obviously, you're going to need to gather a lot of requisite organizational info in order to be prepared. So you're not just in this window of application trying to do everything, but you have a lot of stuff already ready. You're going to be reviewing your narrative and budget. You're going to be having folks review your narrative and budget, and then making sure all the forms are signed and ready to submit. And then we'll do some future sessions on pre-award phase, which is something that gets neglected, I think, in training, is you get your award agreement notification. Yay, you got your grant. There's typically this period of time where you're verifying some of the pre-award conditions and negotiating award terms. This can take weeks to months. I've seen it take up to over a year with EPA, where you're being asked to verify some of the things you said, which can include augmenting your internal systems, making sure your financial accounting systems are up to par, you're tracking personnel time, whatever it is, your procurement policy, all those things are to the federal agency's standards. So maybe creating new policies, obviously solidifying any partners that were part of the application before you get a notice to proceed, and you are not spending any money on this grant in that period. And then award, yay, you've got your notice to proceed, you have a start date. That's when you take the money and run. But really, that has a whole caveat of things that are required. We're going to do a whole session on award management, including reporting, tracking progress and expenses, how to manage contractors and sub-awardees, draw down funds, and then close out. All right, so application phase, trying to make this as high level and simplified as process. Now, obviously, every application has its own requirements, but some things are just true. Obviously, you need to do your due diligence around registration, obtaining your unique entity identifier, and registering on sam.gov, which this can take several weeks. So do it before you even start looking for grants. You don't want to get stuck in this process where you have to verify something, or you're not sure whose email to use. Just be really thoughtful about setting it up in a really clear way, so it's not just one staff person that's in the system and only them can make changes. You need to have an active registration in SAM. So if your organization had one at some time, please track down what state it's in. They do get deactivated if no one has signed into them in a couple months. If it's been a year, you will have to go through the process again. This registration must be renewed annually. So again, if it hasn't been, it's probably time to check and make sure everybody who's listed as a point of contact still works at your organization. And then once you've registered with SAM, you must complete your organization's registration in grants.gov, and that is where you will find and submit most federal grant applications. And then obviously identifying suitable opportunities, which we're going to talk a lot about. So reviewing those funding opportunities carefully. Every agency will have specific funding opportunity guidelines to create your projects and make sure that you're eligible. And we're going to talk a lot about reviewing a NOFO. And then spending some time to gather background info. So both for you, if your utility or organization are going to need to have some documentation on hand, including past financial audits, potentially operations or facility plans, really knowing like the demographics on the population you're serving. Also gathering information about the need. So understanding, being able to communicate, what are the problems that you're wanting to address? What's the current impact of these problems? What's the appropriate what's the appropriate intervention, and what's the impact of that intervention? So all of this can be happening in your pre-project development. This is before you even see a federal funding opportunity. I often tell folks, like, develop your project and budget so that you know when you can recognize the right opportunity, as opposed to like looking at funding opportunities and trying to create a project to meet it. Those rarely are successful. It's just difficult to create a project based on a funding opportunity if it's not the right funding opportunity. Again, we're going to talk a lot about a needs assessment or logic model or problem statement in the next session, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. But I do wanted to caution, like, think about things that might take additional time if you are applying, such as like approval from the city, community input, letters of support, and then obviously developing a project plan, which we're going to get more into what's the components of a good project plan in a moment. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about grants.gov because some of you may be new to it. It's always getting updated, but this is the general format. This is literally a screen share from last week using a basic search criteria. Anyone can search grants.gov. You don't need an account to search or even download a notice of funding opportunity packet. You do need to connect an account in order to apply. So you can work on an application offline, but in order to submit through grants.gov, you need your account to be linked to your sam.gov. So a couple things, if you're looking at your left-hand side of the screen, I wanted to point out, all I did was put in a basic keyword search for wastewater. And I selected opportunity status. If you see the red arrows, that's what I'm referring to. Both upcoming and posted funding opportunities. So these are active or soon to be active, although there was none and soon to be active. Funding instrument type, there's two kinds of funding instrument types on grants.gov. Cooperative agreements, which are grants that require significant input and coordination with the funding agency, and then grants. And then eligibility, I selected city or township government. You can select all entities or you can select one. It's going to show you all the opportunities where a city, for example, is eligible to apply. And then categories, I just select all. Obviously, there's lots of categories of funding. Many grants fall in many categories. And then you can select by agency. So this is not a very exhaustive list. These are all open opportunities. If you look at the opportunity number, that's the funding notice number. The opportunity title, it's the program. Sometimes it mentions the agency. These are all current. Posted date, I did want to note this, and close date. This is when it was put on grants.gov, and this is the deadline for application. If it's open, meaning it has a rolling application until all funds are expended, there's no close date. And when you click on the opportunity number, a window opens up that has some pretty pertinent information, including who's eligible to apply, are there cost match requirements, what's the closing date, i.e. when's the deadline to apply, what's the award ceiling, so the maximum amount, and then the award floor, what's the minimum amount of requests, and it will typically show you the full amount of funding that's available, so you can do the math. If their award ceiling's $1 million and there's 10 million, it's a minimum of 10 grants, or max, so you can often apply for less. Expected number of awards, obviously, is going to be dependent on how much funding there is. Agency contact, there's always a person, a program officer usually, named with an email. So if you're looking for a NOFO and there's things that are just confusing or unclear, email that person. And they actually develop FAQs around the questions that they get. They sometimes amend NOFOs. They sometimes extend closing dates. Don't be afraid to contact that person. And then, of course, you can download the full Notice of Funding Opportunity application. Those are really fun to read. I do a whole session on reading NOFOs, and part of it is no one's got time to look at an 80-page Notice of Funding Opportunity. And so if this falls on you to review these, I just wanted to highlight a few things related to a NOFO that I've found helpful. And to just caveat, read the whole thing. I know it's a lot to read sometimes and it's a lot of legalese, but pay attention to reading the full thing. Things to highlight, period of performance. It's important to know if this is an 18-month grant, if it needs to start on a specific day or month, or is it a 3-year grant and there's flexibility of when it can start. NOFOs should include criteria. Sometimes the actually will have numerical scoring criteria, so what they're looking for when reviewing and how they'll weigh sections of the application. So always pay attention to that. They should include their review and selection process. A lot of time applications through grants.gov will have an initial review of just a pass-fail. Is the entity eligible? Is the application complete? Did it fall within the requirements of the funding? And then it will move to a more subject-specific review process. So that's usually really detailed out in that NOFO. Obviously, the application instructions, super important. Are they requiring you to apply through grants.gov or another portal? Do you have to register with another agency's application platform? What to include, when it's all due, all those things will be in there. Submission dates. Funding restrictions, grants will need to include in a NOFO. Are there things that are ineligible for funding? Sometimes capital projects, sometimes construction, sometimes engineering. It just depends on the funding opportunity. So scan for that right away to make sure if it's a right fit. Procurement restrictions. Some grant notices will include if Build American, Buy American is required. If you can't do business with certain countries, lots of different requirements. If there's a certain like competitive bid process that needs to be used, that should be included in the NOFO. And then some application do require you to document past performance on applications. And if you have ever done non-compliance on a previous award, to verify if you are clear to do business with the government. And those things are derived out of sam.gov. And then, of course, reporting requirements. Typically, those are quarterly. They can be biannually. Something to pay attention as you're putting your budget together is like, how much time is the award management process going to take, including reporting and invoicing. So this application work plan template, this is a link to both in the slides, but the template itself is in the materials. Like I said, includes things like the timeline, tasks, what are the components of the application process, and roles. So who's leading each one of those, and also internal deadlines. And then a lot of the forms for federal applications are uniform, SF424 forms. So in this application work plan, there are samples of those forms or instructions on how to complete those forms linked in the actual work plan. And it's kind of broken out into 4 sections, starting with identifying the funding opportunity, which at least 2 months out. I mean, ideally you have far more time to work on it, but given that funding opportunities get posted and you might not see them for a month and then they're due in 15 days, you definitely want at least 2 months to be reviewing and assessing if it's the right funding opportunity, at least a month out to draft the application packet, at least 2 weeks out to have a peer review of your application, make sure all the forms are completed and compiled, and then don't wait until the day it's due to do a final review and submit. Grants.gov can be finicky. I've definitely had application snafus at the last minute where somebody was not able to log into grants.gov and submit, someone else had to. As Sarah mentioned to me earlier, grants.gov now uses login.gov, which is a federal password system for all federal logins that now you need a passkey and biometric secondary clearance to get into grants.gov. So if it's been a while, log in, make sure your passkey works, is up to date through login.gov. Okay, project plan. Developing a project plan, basically it's a clear and strong supported project plan. So this is something you're going to work either with your team or with your client or TA provider. Like I said, federal agencies vary on what information is required, but they will provide detailed application guides and instructions. So when you're reading through that, just start to be thinking about what you need in terms of background information so you can collect all the relevant data about the existing wastewater system, the problem that needs addressing. Are you working on system failure or capacity issues? And what's your proposed solution? And sometimes that requires an environmental planning process. SRF requires, at least in the LOI process, an environmental information. And then if a full application is offered, then a much more, engineering level type environmental planning process. So this could be part of your facility plan, but it also might require some public input. So those things take time, money, and effort. And also those things are really important when you're dealing with like state EPA review to ensure compliance and environmental laws. I will share a little bit more again about the TA that's available to support these 2 processes in your project plan development for environmental planning and research and data. I'm going to spend more time talking about the detailed budget in the next couple of slides, but basically creating a transparent and detailed budget needs to align with your project plan, being really mindful not to include ineligible costs, but always document your process in coming up with the budget. So I keep a folder of all goods and service quotes that I get, where am I doing like market research for equipment, supplies, or materials. It can just be a screenshot of a website where you're getting quotes and comparisons. How are you coming up with prevailing wage calculations? Also, consider what kind of procurement will be needed, because that will have time and costs associated, including if you have materials that fall under BABA requirements, which again, it's like iron, steel, manufactured products, like lumber, glass, plastic, even fiber optics cable, I think falls under BABA. So those have to be produced and sourced domestically, which has budget implications. And then Davis-Bacon, which I mentioned, prevailing wage, make sure you know what the prevailing wage is in your state and county. And then writing the proposal narrative. So the narrative is your opportunity to make that compelling case for your funding. And standard elements include like an executive summary, which is like the brief overview of the entire project. Really make sure you get peer review of that. That's really clear, concise, and speaks to the funding opportunity criteria. And then a problem statement is where you can get more into like using data and evidence that you've collected on what the issue is to demonstrate the need for the project. And then having really clear goals and objectives that are measurable, time dependent, achievable, and a methodology for how those activities will reach your objectives. So that's also leads into evaluation. How are you measuring the impact of your goals? So you have a clear defined problem statement, you have a really clear defined solution. You need a way to evaluate whether you've met that solution and that solution has addressed your problem. So the next session on Thursday, Sarah and Elaine will get more into developing that part of your application so that it is compelling. And then because a lot of the financing available are low interest loans, you're often asked to have a financial viability plan. That's going to be as complex as the project. So for example, SRF, those can be really small loans. It can be $10,000, they can be 10 million. So your financial viability plan is basically how will you be able to sustain the investment in infrastructure or technology or whatever it is that you're proposing over long term. So it might include rate increases or other revenue sources. Again, it's going to be relative to the complexity of your project. Federal requirements really around what federal funds can be used on is they have to be reasonable, allowable, and allocable, which that's very broad. But when it comes down to it, every one of the expenses in your budget need to be directly related to the project as you describe it. And they have to be realistic, specific, based on quotes or historical data. You can't be padding budgets when using public funds. So I say that because sometimes I'll see some budgets and it's not clear how the line item ties into the project. So federal requirements, they typically have these line items categories. So I'll just briefly go into what they mean so folks are clear. Personnel, you're just basically going to list every position, its role, salary, or wage, and their percentage of time. So that can be a percent of their FTE, or it can be months, or it can be, yeah, that's usually it. And then fringe will be separated out. You're going to calculate costs like insurance, taxes, paid time off, retirement contributions. Don't forget to leave things out of your costs. I see organizations lose money on federal grants all the time because they didn't adequately allocate time and fringe. Travel. So itemize all the travel that you're anticipating. What's the purpose? Where are they going? Estimate airfare and mileage, or look at federal per diem rates. Don't underestimate meals, lodging, related to the project. And then equipment, include items with an acquisition cost of over 10,000 or a useful life of more than a year. So how many of that thing, how much do they cost, even make a model possible. All of this is going to inform your budget narrative. And then supplies, you can group items, unit costs that are under $10,000, even if you exceed that $10,000 threshold, like you want to buy 4 computers. Well, each unit is under 10,000, even if you're going to spend 15,000. So you group those things into supplies. And then contractual or consultant services will fall on its own line item. Sometimes it's just other, but those are external services, organization, individuals that are providing service. And that can be a daily rate, number of days or hours, depends on how they're calculating their costs. Other direct costs often include things like publication, postage, telephone, maintenance fees on equipment, different than indirect, which I'll say a little bit more about. But indirect costs, sometimes called facilities and administrative costs, are general overhead costs associated with the project. It's not with any single part activity, so it's rent, utilities, admin salaries, maybe your financial staff salaries. As I mentioned, if your organization has a negotiated indirect rate agreement, you should use it at that rate. Otherwise, you may be able to just use the 15% de minimis rate, depending on the agency. Yeah.
Hey, Tamara, I might add for if you think but you don't know, you might need a contractor or someone in addition, or any kind of direct costs that you think you might need or could need. If you just throw even a few hundred or a few $1,000s into that item when you do your budget narrative, if it comes up later, you can pay people to do it. If it doesn't, you have wiggle room on your budget to use that money elsewhere. But if it isn't there, you can't do it. So it always makes sense to kind of think ahead of what you might need and just throw a little money there, because then it's in the budget and then you can move things around if you need to.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, your budget isn't written in stone. What will never happen, well, I shouldn't say that. What's unlikely to happen is that the overall amount would change, but you can move amounts between line items. 10% doesn't require a budget amendment. If it's more than 10%, it does. Like Sarah said, if there's nothing in that budget line item, it's pretty difficult to move money to it. And just be thinking about, basically you're creating your budget narrative when you create this budget. The forms are not going to have this level of detail. You're going to have to provide a budget narrative that details written explanation and justification for every single line item, that shows your math. And I've had agencies send things back to say these airfares don't look right. So, I mean, they really do look at it. So again, make it as realistic and anticipatory as possible, even if there's unknowns, like Sarah mentioned, like, you don't know if you're going to lease or buy equipment. Include the higher of the two in your budget and then be able to rebudget if needed. Some budget hot tips. These are pretty self-explanatory here. Obviously, pay attention to excluded costs. So there's a lot of things that are excluded from indirect that folks might not know in the when they're putting their budget together. So there's some commonly excluded costs from applying your indirect rate to, and these can get flagged in the application process. So things like land and buildings, you cannot apply indirect to. Subawards exceeding $50,000. Oftentimes project participation costs, so like compensating people to participate in a planning process, stipends, advertising, obviously debt servicing, contributions. And then there's costs that are excluded because they fall under indirect, so you wouldn't be able to include them, like insurance, general office supplies, maybe even like room rental, utility, as I mentioned. And then I mentioned procurement thresholds, like to be thinking about the time and effort when developing your budget, with purchase of goods and services dependent on if they fall within simplified acquisition, which is anything up to $250,000. You just need to obtain informal quotes from at least 3 suppliers. There are DBA considerations, so most federal agencies will require that a preference for disadvantaged business entities, being preferential for contracts or purchase of goods and services. And then formal acquisition would be things that you're purchasing for over $250,000, either services or goods, and that has to follow a competitive formal acquisition process, which could either mean getting sealed bids, which are going to just be based on cost, and then or competitive, which will be putting an RFP out and then selecting based on qualifications and cost. Those things just take time, staff time, your financial staff time to review that process and making sure you're allocating enough time. Federal grants are administratively burdensome, and still totally doable even for small system managers, but have a lot of requirements. That's why we're here, to help anticipate. Obviously, you're going to want to think about cost match requirements. Make sure if a match is required, you have those funds guaranteed and you're not using, you generally can't match federal grants to federal grants. That's not always true with SRF, but with federal grants, you can't use other federal grants as cost match. Also, you don't want to request more funding than you have cost match for if it's 1-to-1. You have to document use of your cost match just as you have to document drawdown of the funds. And then we didn't get into 2 CFR, but the uniform guidance for federal grants is comprehensive, and you will see reference to it throughout a notice of funding. If it's not clear what it's referring to, sometimes some things will just cite a 2 CFR Part 200 subsection. Go read it. It's not rocket science. It's not always even black and white. It's just guidance. How you fulfill those requirements is generally up to you if it's not super specific, which a lot of it's not, but do know what they're referring to, because sometimes it can be something, like I said, very unintuitive that can either be ineligible costs, ineligible activities. So do the research if you see that in a NOFO. It's worth knowing and checking that you're following all the requirements. This may be obvious, but double check your calculations. Don't wait until the last minute. Have someone on your finance or EFCN or TA provider review your calculations, and don't wait until the last minute. And then submit. So always revise and review. Have, like I said multiple times, have other people review your application, review your forms, make sure everything is included. Avoid jargon that a reviewer is not going to understand what you're referring to, especially very specific, maybe regional information. Assume that whoever's reviewing this does not have the knowledge of your specific wastewater system or water system, or population or environmental considerations. Only submit required forms. This is not a foundation grant. You're not wooing or wowing your reviewers. They're just looking at what they've asked you to submit, and they're going to be looking at dozens and dozens of them. So resist the temptation to submit additional information. Submit early. That can't even tell you how many snafus have happened where a page number dropped off a page and went to another page and it rejected. It's really no fun to be doing this last minute. Through grants.gov, you can track your application process. You can see once it's initially reviewed or if it's in secondary review. It's just helpful to know. Sometimes you don't always know when something is going to be final reviewed or you're going to be notified. And if your application is not funded, most of the time you can request a debrief with the funding agency. You can also request a scoring and see and learn from that application process. And oftentimes that can lead to a second submittal next time around and having a better idea what reviewers are looking at. So I know that was a lot and feels maybe a little overwhelming to embark if this is a new funding source that you're looking at. There are a lot of funding assistance out there. Like that. Funding assistance is easier than finding the unicorn, for sure. EFC Network has technical assistance requests. Zoe shared that in the beginning. And the email to request that. There's environmental centers throughout the country, as I said, who also have TA pro bono resources. There's lots of EPA tools training for small systems. And then there's the state and local regulatory agencies, which are also staffed to help you. And yeah, national and regional economic development organizations are also able to support looking for funding, even pre-project development funding. There's foundations out there really interested in very specific drinking and wastewater issues like PFAS now that I'm seeing grants going out for researching environmental reporting for those. And of course, come to the next two sessions where we will get into narrative and then SRF specific stuff. So you can register for this next session on Thursday or the session for first part of 2 parts on state revolving funds. So thanks. We have a little bit of time. If there's a few questions, here is our contact if we're not able to get to your question, but I know that Zoe's managing the chat. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll take a couple minutes. Thank you for your time.
All right, I'll give a couple seconds for people to get their questions in. I do want to mention one reoccurring question, which is that if you can't join future sessions, will those materials be available? And the answer is yes, they will be available. If you're registered for those sessions, even if you can't attend them, you'll receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and materials. And they'll also be on the EFC and YouTube. But I'll just give a couple more seconds in case anyone wants to put some questions in.
And I will plug, if you're registering for future sessions in this series, there is a section in that RSVP form where you can add your question, and that actually really helps us anticipate there's content for us to review. So if you are registering for future sessions and you have questions about those sessions, include those in your registration so we can anticipate and make sure we have content to address it.
All right, we've got our first question. It says, do your grants support a match waiver due to the economic profile of the applicant?
Yeah, I've seen definitely within grants.gov, EPA and USDA where match is no longer required. And that has been fairly common in the last couple of years, not so much around economic indicators, but the funding is addressing or targeting low and moderate income communities, therefore the cost match is not included. So it's not every grant that requires it. I've never seen a way to request not needing the cost match, although there may be, I don't know, Sarah, have you ever seen that? But I just noticed that cost match is not as standard.
Yeah, I've seen them. I've seen it. It seems to be rarer with EPA. USDA not so much. And I've and oftentimes a match may not be required, but you lose points if you don't include it. So
yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's not 1-to-1. I mean, sometimes it's less. It could be 10%. Yeah. But in some infrastructure projects, I've even seen it 2-to-1, so that you would need twice the amount of funding from other funding sources. Now, they don't have to be grants. They can be other types of resources. They could be in-kind or capital matches of some kind. They don't always have to be cash.
All right, it looks like that might be all of our questions for today. Again, you can ask more questions on, oh, actually, we just had one more question pop up. It says, I recently heard that as a result of the new grants regulations from OMB, some grants are requiring all rewards registration in sam.gov. Have you heard the same?
Well, you have to report any sub-awardees in sam.gov, but when you go into sam.gov and look at your entity, you will see all the federal grants that you've received. And when you close out, that information also gets updated in sam.gov, as well as if you don't close out, you will have a non-compliance report there. Also, if you have over $1 million in federal funding in 1 year, you're required to do a federal audit, a single audit, and that needs to go to the federal clearinghouse. That gets posted also. So there's a lot of cross-posting, but there isn't, like, you don't have to go in and add your federal grants in sam.gov. That just happens once it's awarded. The agency itself will report it based on your UEI number. You are supposed to self-report on sub-recipients under your grant, though. So I'm not sure I answered that question or maybe even understood it, but yeah, as far as I know, all entities, tribal government, city government, local, county government need to have a sam.gov to apply.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Huge
Great.
Thank you to Sarah and Tamira for sharing their expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar, so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.
Thank you.